Imagine for a moment that the Earth's orbit had wobbled just a little differently millions of years ago, that the tilt of our planet had shifted ever so slightly, casting less sunlight on the equator and more shadow across the tropics. In this alternate world, the cradle of humanity would not have been the warm savannas of Africa, but something far colder. Frozen grasslands stretching beneath pale skies, winds that never stopped howling, ice that glinted on every horizon. What would we have become if we had evolved not in warmth, but in the relentless grip of cold? This is not a story about what was, but about what might have been. A journey into an Earth where our ancestors faced winter, not as a season, but as a way of life, where survival demanded not just intelligence, but transformation, where every aspect of our bodies, our minds, and our cultures would have been shaped by the one question that mattered most. How do you endure when the world itself is trying to freeze you? Take a moment to settle in. Maybe the room around you is quiet. Maybe there's a faint hum of wind outside. Whatever brings you here tonight, let's walk together into this frozen world where humanity took a different path, where we became something both familiar and utterly changed. Because in understanding what we might have been, we can see more clearly what we are. And perhaps, in the stillness of this imagined cold, we can glimpse truths about ourselves that warmth alone could never reveal. The story begins with a simple truth that governs all life on Earth. Climate shapes everything. It determines where plants can grow, where animals can hunt, and where complex creatures like us can survive. For most of human evolutionary history, warmth has been our companion. Our earliest ancestors, the Australopithecines who walked upright across the African plains millions of years ago, did so under a sun that rarely failed them. The environment that birthed humanity was one of grasslands and scattered trees, of seasonal rains and dry spells, but never of ice that refused to melt. It was a world where the temperature allowed for a certain kind of body, lean and efficient, built for endurance rather than insulation, where sweat could cool the skin and where naked flesh could withstand the air. But temperature is not just background to evolution, it is one of the most powerful forces driving it. Scientists have discovered through careful analysis of hundreds of fossil remains that body size in the genus Homo, our lineage, has fluctuated significantly over the past million years, and the pattern is striking. Colder climates consistently produced larger bodies. This is not coincidence. It is physics written into flesh. The principle, known as Bergmann's rule, explains that in cold environments, larger bodies are advantageous because they have less surface area relative to their volume. Less surface area means less heat escapes. More mass means more heat is retained. A body built for warmth holds it better than one built for cooling. If our ancestors had evolved in a world perpetually locked in cold, this principle would have become the foundation of our existence. Instead of the varied human body types we see today, adapted to everything from tropical heat to temperate mildness, we would all carry the blueprint of the cold. Every generation would have been shaped by the same unyielding demand: stay warm or die. And over hundreds of thousands of years, that demand would have carved us into something different. Not just taller or broader, but fundamentally reshaped from bone to breath. Imagine standing beside one of these cold, adapted humans. The first thing you would notice is their build. They would not be tall and slender, but compact and powerful. Shorter limbs, yes, but limbs thick with muscle. A torso that appears almost barrel-shaped, wide through the chest and shoulders, offering maximum volume for the organs that generate heat, the heart, the lungs, the digestive system working constantly to convert food into warmth. Their faces would be different too. Broader cheekbones, a nose that is tall and narrow rather than wide and flat. This is not aesthetics. It is survival engineering. That distinctive nasal structure would serve a critical function. Cold, dry air is dangerous to breathe. It can damage the delicate tissues of the lungs and steal precious warmth with every inhalation. But a long, narrow nasal passage increases the surface area through which air must travel before it reaches the lungs. As frigid air moves through this passage, it is warmed by the blood vessels lining the nose. moisture is added. By the time the breath reaches the lungs, it is no longer a threat. Studies of Neanderthals who lived in the glacial climates of Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years show exactly this adaptation. Their noses were not accidents of genetics. They were finely tuned instruments for surviving cold, but it would not stop there. If humanity had evolved entirely in cold, our skeletons would tell a different story than they do now. Bones would be denser, thicker, more robust. Not because cold directly strengthens bone, but because the lifestyle demanded by cold requires it. Hunting large game in frozen landscapes, hauling heavy kills across ice-covered ground, building shelters from mammoth bones and stone. These are not gentle tasks. They require bodies that can withstand tremendous physical stress without breaking. Archaeological evidence shows that cold-adapted hominins like Neanderthals had muscle attachment points on their bones that were far more pronounced than ours, markers of immense muscular strength. Their very skeletons reveal lives of constant exertion, and muscle itself would be central to this transformation. Muscle tissue generates heat. Unlike fat, which insulates passively, muscle is metabolically active. It burns energy, and in doing so produces warmth. A cold-adapted human would carry significantly more muscle mass than we do today, not for strength alone, though that would be a benefit, but as a furnace burning within the body. Every movement, every flex of an arm or step across frozen ground would add to the internal heat reservoir. This is why Neanderthals who faced Ice Age Europe were so powerfully built. Their musculature was not optional, it was survival. The development of this musculature would begin early in life. Children born into the cold would need to develop strength quickly. Their play would not be gentle, it would be rough, physical, preparing their bodies for the demands ahead. By adolescence, the average individual would possess a strength that would seem remarkable to modern eyes. Not the sculpted strength of a gym, but the functional, enduring strength of constant use. Arms that could thrust spears with enough force to pierce thick hide. Backs that could carry heavy loads across kilometers of snow. Legs that could trek through deep drifts without tiring. This strength would come with a particular kind of grace, not the lightness of a dancer, but the sure-footedness of someone who knows that a misstep on ice can mean injury or death. Balance would be honed from childhood. The ability to move across unstable terrain, to adjust to shifting snow or hidden obstacles, would be second nature. Every muscle would be trained not just for power, but for control. Because in the cold, efficiency of movement matters. Wasted energy is wasted heat, and heat is life. The skeletal structure supporting this musculature would be remarkable in its own right. Bones would not just be thicker, they would be differently shaped. The rib cage, for instance, would likely be broader and more bell-shaped, expanding the volume of the chest cavity. This is not merely about protecting organs, it is about creating space for larger lungs. Because cold air is denser than warm air, and breathing it requires more effort. Larger lungs mean more oxygen can be processed with each breath. More oxygen means more efficient metabolism. More efficient metabolism means more heat production and better endurance. The pelvis would be wider as well, providing stability for the heavy torso and the powerful leg muscles needed to move through snow. This wider pelvis would make childbirth somewhat easier, which is fortunate, because the infants born in this cold world would need to be robust from the start. They would be born with more body fat than modern infants, an extra layer of insulation against the cold. Their bodies would prioritize keeping vital organs warm, even if it meant extremities, fingers, toes, sometimes felt the bite of cold more sharply. As these children grew, their bodies would continue to adapt in ways both visible and hidden. The network of blood vessels near the skin surface would be carefully regulated. In extreme cold, these vessels would constrict, reducing blood flow to the extremities to preserve warmth for the core. But during intense activity, when overheating becomes a risk even in freezing conditions, these same vessels would dilate, allowing excess heat to escape. This thermoregulatory system would be finely tuned, responding instantly to changing conditions. It would be the body's way of walking the narrow line between freezing and overheating, a line that in the cold is always present, always demanding attention. Yet muscle comes at a cost. It demands fuel, enormous amounts of it, and in a frozen world where plants are scarce and growth is slow, the only reliable fuel would be meat. Rich, fatty, calorie-dense meat from the great animals that roam the tundra. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, reindeer. To sustain a body built for cold, a cold-adapted human would need to consume thousands of calories every day, far more than we require now. Researchers estimate that Neanderthals needed between 3,360 and 4,480 kilocalories daily to support their metabolic needs during winter. That is nearly double what a modern sedentary adult requires. This dependence on meat would have ripple effects throughout evolution. Digestive systems would adapt to process high-protein, high-fat diets with maximum efficiency. Teeth would become tools not just for chewing, but for tearing and grinding dense tissue. The very chemistry of the gut, the bacteria that live within it, would shift to favour the breakdown of animal protein over plant matter. In this colder world, humanity would be less omnivore and more carnivore, shaped by necessity into hunters whose bodies could only thrive on the flesh of the animals they pursued. The digestive system itself would undergo profound changes. The stomach would become more acidic, better able to break down raw or lightly cooked meat. The intestines might actually shorten slightly compared to our own, because meat requires less processing than plant material. A shorter, digestive tract means less surface area, which means less heat loss. Every aspect of the body would be optimized for this dual purpose: extract maximum energy from food and retain maximum warmth while doing it. The liver would become especially important. This organ, often overlooked, would be the metabolic powerhouse of a cold-adapted human. It processes nutrients from the digestive system, converts them into usable energy, and helps regulate blood sugar levels. In a body constantly burning fuel to stay warm, the liver would work overtime. It would need to be larger, more efficient, capable of storing glycogen, the body's quick-access energy reserve, in greater quantities. When food was scarce, as it inevitably would be during the harshest winters, the liver would be what kept the body functioning, drawing on its reserves to maintain blood sugar and core temperature. But there is another metabolic player that would become critical in this frozen world: brown adipose tissue, often called brown fat. Unlike regular white fat, which stores energy, brown fat burns energy to produce heat directly. It is rich in mitochondria, the cellular powerhouses, and when activated it can generate significant warmth without shivering. In modern humans, brown fat is most abundant in infants, and gradually decreases with age. But in a cold-adapted human, brown fat would remain active throughout life. It would be distributed strategically around vital organs: the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, acting as a personal heating system. The activation of brown fat would be triggered by cold exposure. As the body senses dropping temperatures, signals would be sent to brown fat deposits, telling them to start burning. This process is incredibly efficient. A small amount of brown fat can produce a surprising amount of heat. And unlike shivering, which is exhausting and uses muscle energy, brown fat thermogenesis is relatively effortless. It simply happens, a background warmth that helps keep the core temperature stable even when the outside world is brutally cold. To fuel all of this, the metabolism itself would run hotter, literally and figuratively. Basal metabolic rate, the amount of energy the body uses at rest, would be significantly higher than ours. Even while sleeping, a cold-adapted human would be burning calories at a prodigious rate, maintaining warmth through the night. This creates an interesting challenge during rest periods. Sleep is essential, but sleeping in the cold is dangerous. The body's temperature naturally drops during sleep, and without constant vigilance, hypothermia can set in. The solution would be cultural as much as biological. Sleeping arrangements would never be solitary. People would sleep together, huddled close, sharing body heat. Furs and hides would be piled thick, creating insulated cocoons. Fires would be kept burning through the night, tended by those on watch. and even in sleep the body would maintain a level of metabolic activity that modern humans would find uncomfortable. We're used to our bodies cooling down at night, our metabolism slowing. For a cold-adapted human, slowing down is not an option. The furnace must keep burning, and pursue them they would have to. Because in a landscape where warmth is the most precious resource, standing still is not an option. The cold does not wait. It does not forgive. To survive, every day would demand movement, decision, effort. Which is why the physical transformation would be only the beginning. The cold does not only reshape the body, it reshapes the mind. If you could watch this cold-adapted humanity over thousands of generations, you would see something remarkable emerging alongside their powerful frames and efficient noses. You would see the brain beginning to change, not in shape alone, but in size. Because cold is not just a physical challenge, it is a cognitive one. And evolution, patient and relentless, responds to the problems that matter most. There is a pattern in the fossil record that scientists have only recently begun to fully understand. Brain size in the genus Homo has not grown steadily or predictably. It has fluctuated, sometimes shrinking, sometimes expanding, in response to environmental pressures. And one of the most consistent findings is this. Colder, more arid periods in Earth's history correspond with larger brain sizes, not smaller, larger. This goes against what you might expect. After all, brains are metabolically expensive. They consume roughly 20% of the body's energy, despite making up only 2% of its mass. They generate tremendous amounts of heat, which in a cold environment might seem wasteful. So why would cold drive the evolution of bigger brains? The answer lies in what cold demands of the mind. In a warm, stable environment, survival can be relatively straightforward. Food is abundant, shelter is optional, predators are manageable. But in a world locked in ice, every decision becomes critical. When do you hunt? Where do you hunt? How do you predict the movements of herds across a landscape that offers almost no landmarks? How do you build a fire when wood is scarce, and wind threatens to extinguish every flame? How do you construct a shelter that will hold against storms that can last for days? These are not simple problems. They require planning, memory, abstract thinking, and the ability to learn from failure without dying in the process. A larger brain offers more capacity for these functions, more neurons, more connections, more ability to hold complex mental models of the world and manipulate them. In the frozen plains of an icebound Earth, the humans who could think further ahead, who could remember the patterns of animal migration from year to year, who could innovate new tools and teach those innovations to their children, would be the ones who survived. And slowly, generation by generation, the average brain size would creep upward, not because intelligence alone guaranteed survival, but because the problems posed by cold were cognitive problems, and the brain is evolution's answer to cognitive challenges. Research into human brain evolution shows that starting around 800,000 years ago, brain sizes began increasing significantly. This period coincides with some of the harshest glacial cycles Earth has experienced. The correlation is not perfect. Climate is only one factor among many, but it is consistent enough to suggest a real relationship. Cold climates may have acted as a selective pressure, favouring individuals whose brains could handle the complexity of life in an unforgiving world. If humanity had evolved entirely in such conditions, never knowing the relative ease of warmth, this selective pressure would have been constant. Every generation would face the same cognitive gauntlet. And over time, our brains might have grown even larger than they are now. But size is not the whole story. A bigger brain means nothing if it cannot be fueled. And this is where the metabolic transformation we discussed earlier becomes even more important. The energy required to sustain a large brain in a cold environment is staggering. Not only must the body generate enough heat to keep itself warm, it must also provide the glucose and oxygen that the brain demands every second of every day. This creates a feedback loop. A larger brain helps solve the problems of obtaining food in a harsh environment. But obtaining that food is necessary to sustain the larger brain. The only way this loop can be stable is if the environment provides enough high-quality food to meet the demand. In a frozen world, that food would be meat. specifically fat. Fat is the most energy-dense macronutrient available. A single kilogram of fat contains more than twice the calories of a kilogram of protein or carbohydrate. For a cold-adapted human with a large, energy-hungry brain and a body constantly burning fuel to stay warm, fat would not just be desirable, it would be essential. The bones of Ice Age animals are often found shattered, cracked open to extract the marrow inside. This was not waste, it was necessity. Marrow is almost pure fat, and in a world where every calorie counts, no resource could be ignored. The brain's transformation would not stop at size. Its very structure would adapt to the demands of cold. Certain regions would become more developed. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and decision-making, would be under constant evolutionary pressure to improve. The hippocampus, critical for memory and spatial navigation, would need to be robust to track the movements of herds across vast, featureless landscapes. The motor cortex, which controls fine muscle movements, would be honed by the need to craft increasingly sophisticated tools from stone, bone, and wood. In a sense, the cold would sculpt the brain from the inside out, prioritizing the functions that mattered most for survival. The temporal lobe, which processes auditory information and helps with language, would also see significant development. Communication in the cold is not optional. When hunting large game or coordinating group movements across dangerous terrain, the ability to convey complex information quickly and accurately can mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Words must be precise, meanings must be shared, misunderstandings cannot be tolerated. This pressure would drive language development, pushing it toward greater complexity and clarity. Memory would become one of the most valuable assets a person could possess. Not just short-term memory for immediate tasks, but long-term memory that spans years and decades. An elder who remembers where the herds gathered during a similar winter 20 years ago provides information that no amount of real-time observation can replace. The ability to store these memories, to recall them accurately, and to communicate them to others would be under intense selection pressure. Individuals with better memory would make better decisions, would contribute more to the group's survival, and would be more likely to have their genes passed forward. But memory is not just about storage, it is about pattern recognition. The brain must take disparate pieces of information, scattered across time and space, and weave them into coherent narratives. Where did we find water last time the winter was this harsh? What do those clouds mean? Why are the reindeer moving east instead of west? These are not simple observations. They are puzzles that require the brain to compare current conditions against a vast library of past experiences, identify similarities, and make predictions. This kind of cognitive work is what large, complex brains excel at. And in a frozen world, it would happen constantly. Spatial reasoning would reach heights that might surpass our own capabilities, navigating a landscape covered in snow where familiar landmarks are hidden and the horizon looks the same in every direction, requires an almost supernatural sense of direction. The brain would develop enhanced abilities to track position relative to the sun, the stars, the prevailing winds. Mental maps would be extraordinarily detailed, encoding not just geography but seasonal changes. This stream freezes in winter, but that one does not. This valley traps wind, but that one channels it. This hillside always has game, but only in the spring. The amount of information that must be held and cross-referenced is staggering. Problem-solving would be elevated to an art form. Every day would present challenges that require creative solutions. The spear breaks mid-hunt. What can be improvised from available materials? The shelter's hide covering tears in a storm. How can it be repaired when fingers are numb with cold? Food stores are running low, and the herds have not yet arrived. What alternative resources can sustain the group? These problems cannot be solved by instinct alone. They require the ability to think abstractly, to imagine solutions that have never been tried, to innovate under pressure. And innovation would compound over generations. Each small improvement in tool design, each new technique for processing hides or preserving meat, each insight into animal behavior or weather patterns would be added to the collective knowledge base. The brain would not just solve problems, it would build on the solutions of those who came before. This cumulative cultural knowledge would become in many ways, an extension of the brain itself. Not stored in neurons, but stored in traditions, in stories, in the physical artifacts that are passed down and refined with each generation. Yet there is a limit to how large a brain can grow. At a certain point, the cost outweighs the benefits. Childbirth becomes more dangerous as infant head size increases. The metabolic burden becomes unsustainable. The brain begins generating so much heat that it risks overheating even in cold conditions. Evolution is always a balance of trade-offs, and in a frozen world, that balance would be struck differently than it was in the warm African savannas where we actually evolved. The humans of this colder Earth would likely have larger brains than we do now, but not infinitely so. They would be at the edge of what biology allows, walking a tightrope between cognitive power and physical sustainability. The emotional centers of the brain would adapt as well. Fear would need to be carefully calibrated. Too much fear and a person freezes, unable to act when action is required. Too little fear and risks are taken that should not be. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, would become finely tuned to distinguish between immediate threats and distant possibilities. The prefrontal cortex would need strong connections to the amygdala, allowing rational thought to modulate emotional responses. Stay calm when the predator is near. Feel urgency when the storm approaches. Know when to fight and when to flee. Empathy, too, would be shaped by cold. In a world where survival depends on cooperation, the ability to understand what others are feeling, to anticipate their needs, to respond to their distress, becomes essential. Mirror neurons, the brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we see others perform it, would be highly developed. This would allow for rapid learning through observation and would strengthen the social bonds that hold groups together. When you can feel, on some level, what another person is experiencing, you are more likely to help them, to share with them, to trust them. And trust is the foundation of cooperation. And walking that tightrope would require one more adaptation, perhaps the most important of all, not in bone or brain, but in behavior. Because in a world defined by cold, the single most transformative technology would not be the spear or the knife. It would be fire. Fire is ancient. Evidence of controlled fire use goes back at least 1 million years, perhaps even further. But there is a difference between using fire opportunistically and mastering it, between carrying embers from a lightning strike and creating flame on demand. In a warm climate, fire is useful. In a cold climate, fire is everything. It is warmth when the body's furnace is not enough. It is light when the winter sun sets early and rises late. It is protection from predators who fear the flames. It is the means to cook meat, making it easier to digest and safer to eat. And perhaps most importantly, fire is the center of social life, the place where knowledge is shared, where stories are told, where children learn and communities bond. If humanity had evolved in relentless cold, fire would not have been a tool among many. It would have been the tool, the cornerstone of existence. And as a result, the mastery of fire would have developed earlier, deeper, and more completely than it did in our actual history. Archaeological evidence from the coldest periods of the Ice Age shows that humans built sophisticated fireplaces, structures designed not just to burn, but to burn efficiently. They understood which woods produced the most heat, which materials could supplement scarce timber, bones, animal fat, dried dung. They knew how to build fires that could withstand wind, how to construct hearths that radiated warmth into shelters, and how to maintain flames for days or even weeks without letting them die. In recent excavations in Ukraine, researchers uncovered hearths dating to the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the most recent ice age. These hearths reached temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Celsius. That is not a casual fire. That is controlled combustion, carefully managed and expertly maintained. The people who built these fires understood pyrotechnology in ways that would impress even modern fire specialists. They knew how to regulate airflow, how to layer fuel for sustained burning, and how to create different types of fires for different purposes. Some fires were for warmth, broad and steady. Others were for cooking, hotter and more focused. Still others may have been for light, or for working materials, softening hides or hardening wooden spear points. This level of mastery does not happen by accident. It develops over generations of trial and error, of knowledge carefully passed from parent to child, from elder to novice. In a world where losing the fire could mean death, every individual would need to understand not just how to use fire, but how to create it. The friction method, rubbing sticks together until the heat ignites tinder, would be taught early and practiced until it became second nature. The use of iron pyrite, a stone that sparks when struck against flint, would be understood and valued. Fire-making tools would be among the most prized possessions, carried everywhere, guarded carefully, and crafted with precision. The knowledge required to make fire would extend beyond the simple mechanics of creating a spark. It would include deep understanding of materials. Not all wood burns the same. Soft woods like pine ignite quickly, but burn fast and hot. Useful for quick warmth, but wasteful if fuel is scarce. Hardwoods burn slower and steadier, providing sustained heat through long winter nights. Birch bark, with its natural oils, catches fire even when damp. Dried grasses and shredded bark make excellent tinder, catching the first spark and nursing it into flame. Fungi, particularly certain types that grow on trees, can be processed into slow-burning materials that hold embers for hours, allowing fire to be transported from place to place. The preparation of these materials would be an ongoing task. During brief summer months, when the world thaws slightly, people would gather and prepare fire supplies for the long cold to come. Bark would be stripped and dried, wood would be cut and seasoned. Tinder would be collected and stored in waterproof containers made from hide or bark. This is not idle work. It is survival work. Every bundle of kindling prepared in summer is a fire that can be lit in winter. Every piece of flint napped into the right shape is a tool that might save a life. The tools themselves would evolve to serve multiple purposes. A stone blade is not just for cutting. In skilled hands, it becomes a scraper for cleaning hides, a chisel for working bone, a way to harvest bark without killing the tree. Bone needles, painstakingly fashioned from the ribs or leg bones of hunted animals, would allow for the creation of fitted clothing, sewn together with sinew to create garments that trap warmth close to the body. These needles would be tiny marvels of engineering, smooth and sharp, threaded through multiple layers of hide with patience and precision. Clothing itself would be technology as vital as fire. In moderate cold, a single layer of fur might suffice, but in the deep cold, survival demands layering. An inner layer of soft hide, fur against the skin, trapping a layer of warm air. A middle layer of thicker fur for insulation. An outer layer of tightly woven or sealed hide to block wind and moisture. The seams would be carefully treated, rubbed with fat to waterproof them. Hoods would be essential, protecting the head where heat loss is greatest. Mittens rather than gloves, because keeping fingers together preserves more warmth than separating them. The creation of these garments would be skilled labour, demanding hours of work. Hides must be scraped clean of fat and tissue, a process that strengthens the arms and requires sharp, well-maintained tools. They must be treated to prevent rotting, often using a mixture of brain matter from the animal, which contains natural tanning agents. They must be softened through repeated working, stretching and rubbing, until they become supple enough to sew. Every step is time-consuming. Every step is necessary. A poorly made garment can fail at the worst possible moment, exposing skin to cold that frostbites in minutes. But fire alone is not enough. You can burn forever and still freeze if the heat escapes into the open air. Shelter becomes the second pillar of survival, and in a frozen world, shelter would be more than a roof overhead. It would be an engineering feat. In regions where trees are scarce, where the only building materials are what the land provides, cold-adapted humans would learn to construct dwellings from the bones of the animals they hunted. Mammoth skeletons, massive and sturdy, could be arranged into frameworks, ribs interlocking, long bones serving as support beams. Over this skeleton, hides would be stretched, layered thick to block the wind. Inside, the ground would be lined with furs and grasses, insulation against the cold seeping up from below. These shelters would be small, deliberately so. a small space is easier to heat than a large one. Body heat combined with a carefully managed fire could raise the interior temperature enough to make sleep possible without freezing. Entrances would be narrow and low, designed to minimize heat loss. Some shelters might even be partially buried, dug into the earth to take advantage of the ground's insulation. The permafrost beneath would be an enemy in some ways, but in others, an ally, a stable foundation that would not shift or sink. The construction of such shelters requires planning, cooperation, and skill. It is not work for one person, it demands a group. And that brings us to perhaps the most profound transformation that cold would impose. Not in body, not in brain, not even in fire, but in the way humans relate to one another. Because in a frozen world, survival is not an individual achievement, it is a collective one. Hunting in the cold is nothing like hunting in warmth. The animals are larger, more dangerous, and harder to kill. A lone hunter might bring down a rabbit or a bird, but a mammoth, a woolly rhinoceros, a herd of bison. These require cooperation on a scale that transforms social structure. A successful hunt involves scouting, where individuals range far from camp to locate herds. It involves planning, deciding when and where to strike. It involves coordination, with hunters working together to drive animals toward a trap, a cliff, or a place where spearmen wait in ambush. And it involves sharing, because no individual can consume an entire mammoth before the meat spoils. The kill must be divided, transported, and distributed according to rules that the group has agreed upon. This kind of cooperation is not instinctive, it must be learned, and more than that, it must be enforced. Free riders, individuals who benefit from the group's success without contributing, threaten the entire system. In a warm climate, a free rider might be tolerated or ignored, but in the cold, where every hunt is a matter of life and death, free riders cannot be afforded. Social mechanisms would evolve to identify and manage them. Reputation would matter enormously. Who can be trusted to contribute? Who has the skills to lead a hunt? Who will share fairly and who will hoard? These questions would be answered not through written rules, but through observation, memory, and social pressure. Leadership would emerge, not as formal authority, but as earned respect. The best hunters, the most skilled firemakers, the elders who remember the harshest winters and the strategies that worked, these individuals would guide the group. Their knowledge would be invaluable, and because knowledge in a frozen world can mean the difference between survival and extinction, the transmission of that knowledge would become sacred. Children would learn not just by watching, but by doing, under the guidance of those who have mastered the skills. Stories would be told around the fire, not for entertainment alone, but to encode lessons, to remember the locations of resources, the behaviours of animals, the signs that predict weather changes. This emphasis on knowledge transmission would shape culture in profound ways. Language would become more complex, capable of expressing not just immediate needs but abstract concepts. Time, causality, probability. The words for tomorrow, for if, for because, would be essential. Teaching requires the ability to explain, to hypothesize, to correct, and that requires language sophisticated enough to handle nuance. In this colder world, language might have developed earlier and more richly than it did in our actual history. Every generation would inherit a more complex linguistic toolkit, each building on the last. Cooperation would extend beyond the hunt. Shelter construction, as we discussed, is a group effort. So is fire maintenance. In the harshest winters, keeping a fire alive around the clock might require shifts, individuals taking turns feeding the flames while others rest. Childcare would be communal, because parents cannot hunt and gather effectively if they must also watch their children every moment. The very young and the very old would be cared for not out of abstract morality, but because their knowledge and potential contributions outweigh the cost of feeding them. An elder who can no longer hunt might still teach, might still craft tools, might still remember where the herds gathered 20 winters ago. These social bonds would be reinforced through ritual, shared meals after a successful hunt, storytelling by firelight, markings on tools or clothing to signify membership in the group. Even burial practices, the deliberate interment of the dead with care and perhaps offerings would serve a social function. They would affirm that every individual matters, that the group honours its members even after death. This is not sentimentality. It is the glue that holds cooperation together. If you believe the group will remember you, will mourn, you will care for your children if you fall, you're more willing to take risks for the collective good. In a frozen world, this web of cooperation, knowledge and trust would be the true engine of survival. Bodies could be powerful, brains could be large, fire could be mastered. But without the ability to work together, to share, to teach and to trust, none of it would be enough. The cold does not just forge individuals, it forges societies. And those societies, bound by necessity and shaped by hardship, would be the foundation upon which everything else is built. Now imagine these cold-adapted humans, not as distant figures in a thought experiment, but as ancestors. What would they have passed down to us? If we, here in the present, were their descendants, what traces would remain in our bodies, our minds, our cultures? This is where the alternate history we have been walking through begins to touch something real. Because even though humanity did not evolve entirely in the cold, we have been shaped by it more than we often realise, and imagining what we might have been can reveal truths about what we are. The physical adaptations would linger. Even in a world that has warmed, bodies built for cold would carry forward. We would likely be stockier on average, with broader torsos and shorter limbs. Our noses would retain that tall, narrow shape, efficient at warming air even when the air no longer needs as much warming. Muscle mass would remain higher, a legacy of ancestors who needed every ounce of strength to survive. These traits would be written into our genes, slow to change even as the environment shifted. It would take thousands of generations of living in warmth before the selective pressures reversed and our bodies began to slim down, to adapt to heat rather than cold. But some traits might never fully reverse. Our metabolic needs, for instance. A cold-adapted human requires more calories to function. Even if the world warms and activity levels drop, the baseline metabolic rate might remain elevated, a relic of the past. This could manifest in modern populations as a higher susceptibility to certain health conditions when caloric intake does not match that ancient demand, or it might show up in our dietary preferences, a deep, almost instinctive craving for fats and proteins, not because we need them now, but because our ancestors needed them then, and evolution does not forget quickly. The brain would carry forward as well. A larger brain, shaped by the cognitive demands of cold, would not shrink easily. In fact, the modern human brain has been decreasing slightly in size over the past 10,000 years or so, likely due to changes in diet, lifestyle and social structure as we moved into agricultural societies. But if our baseline had been larger to begin with, we might still possess brains that are significantly bigger than the ones we actually have. What would that mean? Potentially greater capacity for abstract thinking, for memory, for problem solving, but also greater metabolic cost. A civilization of people with larger brains might develop technology faster, might produce more innovation, but might also require more resources per person to sustain. Or perhaps the difference would not be in size, but in structure. The regions of the brain honed by cold, those responsible for planning, memory and spatial reasoning, might remain disproportionately developed. We might be, as a species, exceptional at long-term thinking, at navigation, at managing complex systems. The cultures that arose from such minds might value these skills above others. They might build societies organised around careful planning and resource management, because that is what the brain does best when it has been shaped by necessity. Waste would be minimised. Efficiency would be prized. The idea of living only for the present, of not planning for the future, might feel almost alien, and the social structures, those intricate webs of cooperation and trust, would leave their mark as well. A humanity forged in the cold would carry forward a deep emphasis on community, on collective effort, on the idea that survival depends on the group rather than the individual. This is not to say that individualism would be absent. Humans are too complex for any single trait to dominate entirely, but the balance would be different. Societies might be more egalitarian, because in the cold, Hoarding resources is less effective than sharing them. The hunter who keeps an entire kill to himself gains little if the rest of the group starves and can no longer help on the next hunt. Better to share, to build reciprocal relationships, to ensure that when you are the one in need, others will help you. This cultural legacy might also show up in how we think about knowledge. In a world where elders hold the keys to survival, where every piece of information about where to hunt, how to build, when to migrate is precious, knowledge would be treated with reverence. Education would not be a luxury, it would be a necessity. Every child would be taught, rigorously and thoroughly, because ignorance is lethal. In modern times, this might translate into societies that prioritize universal education, that invest heavily in passing knowledge from one generation to the next, that view the loss of traditional wisdom as a genuine crisis. Even our technology would reflect this past. Fire, the cornerstone of survival in the cold, might hold a symbolic significance that goes beyond its practical use. Homes might be built around central fireplaces, not because they are needed for heat anymore, but because they evoke something deep and primal. The hearth as the heart of the home, the gathering place, the space where stories are told and bonds are formed. This is not just nostalgia. It is the echo of a time when the fire was the difference between life and death, and perhaps most intriguingly, our psychological traits would carry forward. Anxiety, for instance. In a cold world, vigilance is survival. The individual who constantly scans the horizon for threats, who worries about whether there is enough food, who plans obsessively for the worst-case scenario, is more likely to survive than the one who relaxes and assumes everything will be fine. Over time, this vigilance could become ingrained, not just as a learned behaviour, but as a baseline temperament. A humanity descended from cold-adapted ancestors might, on average, be more prone to anxiety, more cautious, more risk-averse, not out of weakness, but as a legacy of strength, the traits that kept them alive. Yet there would be trade-offs. A brain built for planning and memory might struggle with spontaneity. A body built for strength might be less efficient at endurance. A culture built around cooperation might be slower to adapt when conditions favour individual initiative. No evolutionary path is perfect. Every adaptation closes off certain possibilities even as it opens others. The humans of this colder world would not be superior to us. They would simply be different, shaped by different forces, carrying different strengths and different weaknesses. Yet there would be trade-offs. A brain built for planning and memory might struggle with spontaneity. A body built for strength might be less efficient at endurance. A culture built around cooperation might be slower to adapt when conditions favour individual initiative. No evolutionary path is perfect. Every adaptation closes off certain possibilities even as it opens others. The humans of this colder world would not be superior to us. They would simply be different, shaped by different forces, carrying different strengths and different weaknesses. But let us continue deeper into this frozen world, beyond the physical and cognitive adaptations, into the daily rhythms that would define life. Because understanding what we might have been requires walking through not just the grand evolutionary forces, but the small moments, the quiet details, the textures of existence that would shape every hour of every day. The cycle of seasons in a perpetually cold world would be different from anything we know. There would still be variation, certainly. Even in the depths of an ice age, the planet experiences rhythms, but the range would be compressed. Where we might experience the shift from freezing winter to warm summer, a cold-adapted humanity would know only degrees of cold. Winter would be brutal, deadly, a time when survival itself becomes the only goal. Summer would not be warm, but merely less cold. A brief window when the ice retreats slightly, when meltwater flows, when the sparse vegetation of the tundra springs to life in a desperate rush to grow and seed before the freeze returns. This abbreviated growing season would shape everything. The animals that survive in such a world must be hardy, able to extract nutrition from the tough grasses, and lichens that manage to grow. Reindeer and caribou, with their ability to digest plants that would starve other herbivores. Musk oxen, standing firm against winds that never cease. And the great woolly mammoths, those icons of the Ice Age, with their layered coats and curved tusks perfect for sweeping snow aside to reach the vegetation beneath. These would be the prey. These would be the reason humans could exist at all in such a place. The hunting of these animals would not be casual or opportunistic. It would require intimate knowledge built over lifetimes, understanding migration patterns, knowing when the herds move and where they go, recognizing the signs of animal behavior, the way a herd shifts when predators are near, the calls they make to warn each other, the weak individuals that lag behind. This knowledge would be passed down with the same care as the knowledge of fire, because a successful hunt might feed the group for weeks. A failed hunt might mean starvation. The act of hunting itself would be theatre and strategy combined. Patience measured in hours or days, positioning the hunters where the animals would pass, using natural features of the landscape. A narrow valley that funnels movement, a cliff edge that offers no escape, a frozen lake where running is treacherous. The hunters would not charge in recklessly. They would wait. They would coordinate with gestures and signals practiced until they become instinct, and when the moment came, they would move as one unit with a single purpose. The weapons would be simple but effective. Spears with stone points, hafted carefully onto wooden shafts. The throwing spear, launched with the aid of an atlatl, a tool that extends the arm and multiplies force, allowing the spear to fly farther and strike harder. The thrusting spear, heavier and more robust, used when close combat cannot be avoided. Each weapon would be maintained constantly. A dull point is a liability. A loose haft is a death sentence. Before every hunt, the weapons would be checked, adjusted, and if necessary, repaired. This is not superstition. It is practical wisdom born from watching what happens when tools fail. After the kill, the real work begins. A mammoth, massive and unwieldy, cannot simply be dragged back to camp. It must be processed where it falls. Butchering in the cold presents its own challenges. Meat freezes quickly, which is both blessing and curse. Frozen meat preserves longer, yes, but it also becomes harder to cut, harder to separate from bone and sinew. The hunters would work fast, their breath steaming in the frigid air, hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the cold numbing their fingers. The first cuts would be strategic. Open the body cavity to access the organs, the liver, rich in nutrients, the heart, dense with protein, the fat deposits, precious beyond measure. These would be claimed first, divided according to the rules the group has established. Not equal shares necessarily, but shares that reflect contribution and need. The hunter who made the killing blow receives honour, the elder who guided the strategy receives respect. The nursing mother receives extra, because her body feeds not only herself, but the next generation. Nothing would be wasted. The hide would be carefully removed, a task requiring skill to avoid damaging the skin. A good mammoth hide, thick and well preserved, could serve many purposes. Shelter covering, blankets, wrapping for the dead, even footwear, cut and sewn into boots that provide essential insulation against the frozen ground. The bones, massive and durable, would be collected for tools and construction. Ribs become structural supports. Long bones become hammers and wedges. Even the tusks, though difficult to work, could be shaped into implements or used whole as levers and stakes. The meat would be divided into portions that can be carried. Strips cut from the muscle, bundled and tied. Chunks of fat carefully preserved. Even the intestines, cleaned and prepared, could serve as containers or as casing for preserved meats. The transport back to camp would be a communal effort, everyone carrying what they can, moving in a line across the snow, and in camp, the processing would continue. Some meat eaten immediately, cooked over the fire and consumed while hot. Other meat preserved for the future. Preservation techniques in a frozen world would be sophisticated. Freezing is the obvious method, but it is not always reliable. Temperatures can fluctuate. Scavengers can steal. Better to smoke the meat, hanging strips near the fire where the smoke permeates the flesh, adding flavour and creating a barrier against rot. Or to dry it, laying it on racks in the cold, dry air, where it desiccates into something hard and long-lasting. This dried meat, later known as pemmican when mixed with fat and berries, would be survival food, dense with calories, light enough to carry and stable enough to last months. The fat would receive special treatment. Rendered over low heat, it separates from impurities and becomes a pure golden substance that can be stored in containers made from bladders or sections of intestine. This rendered fat is fuel for lamps, providing light during the long darkness. It is waterproofing for seams and leather. It is medicine, rubbed into cracked skin to prevent frostbite. And most importantly, it is food, eaten in chunks or melted into soups, providing the concentrated energy that cold-adapted bodies crave. Living in such a world would mean living with hunger as a constant companion. Not always the sharp, immediate hunger of starvation, but the chronic awareness that food is never guaranteed. That the next meal depends on success in hunting, on the movements of animals beyond your control, on weather that can turn deadly without warning. This would shape psychology in profound ways. The relief of a full belly would be sweeter than anything we can imagine. The anxiety of watching food stores dwindle would be a weight that never fully lifts, but there would also be abundance, strange as that sounds. When a hunt succeeds, when a mammoth falls and feeds the group for weeks, there would be celebration. Not wild or wasteful, but genuine. Songs around the fire, stories of the hunt told and retold, each telling adding embellishments, building the event into something larger than itself. Children would listen, wide-eyed, learning not just what happened, but what it means to be part of something greater than yourself, to contribute, to share, to honour the animal that gave its life so that you might live. These stories would serve multiple functions. Entertainment, yes, during the long dark hours when there is nothing to do but sit by the fire and wait for dawn. But also education, encoding practical knowledge in narrative form. The story of the mammoth that turned and charged teaches wariness. The story of the hunter who ventured onto thin ice and fell through teaches caution. The story of the clever trapper who used the wind to mask his scent teaches strategy. Every tale contains lessons, and children absorb them without realizing they are being taught. Art would emerge from this, naturally and inevitably. Not art for art's sake initially, but art as communication, as record-keeping, as magic. The painted caves we know from our actual prehistory, those stunning galleries of animals rendered in ochre and charcoal, would have equivalents in this colder world. Perhaps even more elaborate because the need to remember, to preserve knowledge across seasons when nothing can be hunted, would be even more acute. The walls would show not just what animals look like, but how they move, where they are found, how they respond to different strategies. And there would be symbolic art as well. Carved figures, small enough to carry, representing animals or humans or abstract concepts. These would serve as teaching tools, as talismans, as ways to communicate, ideas that words alone cannot capture. A carved mammoth might represent abundance. A carved wolf might represent danger or respect for predators. A carved human figure might represent an ancestor, a reminder of those who came before and the knowledge they passed down. Music would exist too, though in forms adapted to the environment. Wind instruments made from bone, hollow tubes that produce haunting tones when breath passes through them. Percussion from stretched hide, drumbeats that carry across the snow and through the darkness. Song, of course, because the human voice is the first and most versatile instrument. Songs to coordinate work, the rhythms helping groups move in unison. Songs to soothe children. Songs to honour the dead. Songs to pass the time during the endless winter nights when sleep is difficult and the cold presses in from all sides. The relationship with animals in this world would be complex and deeply spiritual. Not worship exactly, but profound respect. The mammoth that feeds you is not just meat. It is a being that walked the earth, that breathed and felt and struggled to survive just as you do. Killing it is necessary, but it is not casual. Rituals would develop around the hunt, around the butchering, around the consumption. Thanking the animal's spirit, apologizing for the necessity of its death, promising to use every part to waste nothing, to honor the sacrifice. This respect would extend to predators as well. The wolves that follow the herds, the great cats with their saber teeth, even the scavenging birds that circle overhead. These are not enemies exactly, though they can be dangerous. They are fellow hunters, fellow survivors in a world that gives nothing freely. There might be moments of conflict, certainly, when a kill is contested, or when a predator becomes too bold near camp. But there would also be a kind of understanding. You hunt your way. We hunt ours. The world is large enough for both. The spiritual life of cold-adapted humans would likely be animistic, seeing spirit and intention in natural phenomena. The wind that brings storms is not just air in motion. It is a force with purpose, with mood, with power. The sun, weak as it is in winter, is still the source of all light and warmth. Its daily arc across the sky would be watched, marked, celebrated. The longest night of the year, when the sun barely rises above the horizon, would be a time of anxiety but also of hope. Because after that night the days begin to lengthen, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but lengthening nonetheless. Spring, such as it is, will come. The cycle continues. Stars would hold particular significance. In a world where darkness dominates for much of the year, the night sky becomes familiar in ways we can barely imagine. Every constellation memorized, every bright star named. The movements of celestial bodies tracked not with instruments, but with careful observation over years and decades. The stars do not just provide light, they provide navigation, orientation when the land is featureless and covered in snow. They provide the calendar, marking the passage of time and the approach of seasonal changes. And they provide wonder, those distant points of light that never change, that always return to the same positions, that suggest order and pattern in a world that often feels chaotic. The concept of time itself would be understood differently. Without the clear markers of spring, summer, fall, winter that we rely on, time would be measured in subtler increments. The return of certain stars, the behaviour of animals, the thickness of ice on rivers, the angle of the sun at midday. An elder might speak of an event happening 3 migrations of the caribou ago, or when the ice was thick enough to walk on but not thick enough to hold a mammoth. These are not precise measurements in our sense, but they are meaningful, grounded in the rhythms of the world that everyone understands. Childhood in this frozen world would be brief. Not because life is short, though mortality rates would certainly be higher than in our modern world, but because usefulness cannot wait. A child of 5 or 6 winters would already have responsibilities, carrying water, gathering small sticks for kindling, watching younger siblings. By 10 winters, a child would be learning the skills that will define their adult life. Boys accompanying men on hunts, not as active participants yet, but as observers, carriers, helpers. Girls learning from women the intricate work of hide processing, sewing, food preparation. But this should not be romanticised as some idyllic connection to nature. It would be hard, exhausting. Children would see death regularly, siblings lost to cold or illness, elders who can no longer contribute and quietly accept their fate, hunters who do not return from the chase. This exposure to mortality would shape worldview, creating a pragmatism that might seem cold to modern sensibilities but is simply realistic acknowledgement of how the world works. Yet there would be joy too. The play of children, even in such harsh circumstances, would be irrepressible. Games that teach skills, wrestling matches that build strength, contests of throwing or running or stealth, laughter by the fire, the warmth of bodies pressed together during sleep, the comfort of knowing you're not alone in the dark, the pride of mastering a new skill, of being praised by an elder, of contributing something meaningful to the group's survival. These moments would matter. They would be remembered. They would make life worth living. Adolescence would be marked by transition ceremonies, not arbitrary ages but demonstrated competence. A boy becomes a man when he makes his first solo kill, proving he can feed himself and others. A girl becomes a woman when she masters the skills of the home, showing she can maintain a household and raise the next generation. These transitions would be celebrated, acknowledged by the entire group because they represent not just individual growth, but the continuation of the community. Every new adult is another pair of hands, another mind, another contributor to survival. Mating and reproduction would be approached with practical considerations overlaying emotional bonds. Love exists, certainly. the desire for companionship, for partnership, for someone to share the burden with. But practicality matters too. A good hunter paired with a skilled crafter produces a household that can thrive. A strong male and a healthy female produce children more likely to survive. These calculations are not cold or calculating in the modern sense. They are simply part of how one thinks about the future when the future is always uncertain. But partnerships would still be chosen, not assigned. Because cooperation requires willing participants. A pairing forced by others is a pairing that might fail at the critical moment, when trust and teamwork are all that stand between survival and death. Better to allow choice, to let people find their own matches, to trust that individuals will make decisions that benefit both themselves and the group. Pregnancy in the cold would be a time of both celebration and anxiety. A child represents the future, the continuation of the line, new hands that will one day contribute. But pregnancy is also vulnerability. A pregnant woman cannot hunt as effectively, cannot run if danger threatens, cannot work as hard in the final months. The group must support her, must provide for her, and this requires resources that are always scarce. Yet it would be done, because without children, there is no future. The investment is essential, even when it is costly. Childbirth itself would be dangerous, more so than in our modern world with its medical knowledge and interventions. Women would die, babies would die. Those who survive would be celebrated, welcomed into the world with rituals and blessings, with hopes and fears voiced in the presence of the community. The infant would be examined, checked for signs of health or weakness. A weak baby, one unlikely to survive the harsh conditions, might face a terrible decision. Resources are limited. Sentiment cannot always overrule practicality. Yet every such decision would weigh on the community, would be remembered, would become part of the shared burden of living in a world that demands such choices. Healthy infants would be cherished, protected, nurtured with all the care the group can provide. Mothers would nurse for years, because the milk provides not just nutrition but antibodies, protection against illness in a world where infection can kill. The infant would be carried constantly, strapped to the mother's body where her warmth keeps it from freezing. Sleep would be communal, the baby nestled between adults whose bodies create a cocoon of warmth. Every member of the group would take an interest in the child's welfare because every child is an investment in the future, a potential contributor when they come of age. As the child grows, the transmission of culture would be constant and immersive. There would be no formal schools, no designated teachers. Every adult is a teacher. Every activity is a lesson. Watching how hides are scraped teaches patience and the importance of thorough work. Listening to stories teaches history, strategy, values. Participating in hunts teaches courage, coordination, the reading of landscapes and animals. Life itself is the curriculum, and graduation comes not with a ceremony, but with the quiet recognition that you are now one of the providers, one of the keepers of knowledge, one of those responsible for the next generation. Language, as we have touched on, would be rich and nuanced, but it would also be economical. In the cold, brevity matters. Conversations would be direct, stripped of unnecessary pleasantries. The herd moves east. The ice is thin. We need wood. Information communicated clearly and quickly. But around the fire, when there is time, language would blossom. Stories would be elaborate, descriptions vivid, emotions expressed with words carefully chosen for their weight and meaning. The vocabulary would reflect the environment. Where we have one word for snow, a cold-adapted language might have dozens. Wet snow that packs well, dry snow that blows in the wind, fresh snow that fell last night, old snow compressed into ice, crusted snow with a hard surface, granular snow like sugar. Each type has different properties, different implications for travel, for hunting, for safety. Knowing which word to use is not pedantry, it is survival. Similarly, there would be rich vocabulary for ice, for wind, for cold itself. The biting cold of high wind, the deep cold of still air, the creeping cold that numbs extremities, the sudden cold of water. Each has its own character, its own danger, its own name, and in speaking these names, in using This precise language, people would communicate not just information but experience. The person who says the wind carries the bone cold is understood immediately by everyone who has felt that particular sensation, that cold that seems to reach inside and chill the marrow itself. Numbers would exist but might be less abstract than ours. 1, 2, many. Specific counts when they matter. 5 hunters. 3 mammoths, but also more general terms. A herd. A few. Enough. Not enough. The precision we value in modern mathematics would be less important than the practical assessment. Do we have enough food to last the winter? That is a more useful question than exactly how many kilograms of meat are stored. Storytelling would be the primary form of entertainment and education, but it would also be history, religion, law, all woven together. The story of the great blizzard that killed half the group 3 generations ago is a warning about complacency. The story of the ancestor who discovered a new hunting ground is a reminder to explore, to be bold, to innovate. The story of the thief who was expelled from the group is a lesson about the consequences of breaking trust. Every story serves multiple purposes, entertaining while teaching, preserving while moralizing, and these stories would evolve over time, each telling adding new details, polishing rough edges, emphasizing certain themes. The greatest storytellers would be honored members of the community, their skill valued as highly as the skill of the best hunters. Because while hunters feed the body, storytellers feed the mind and spirit. They preserve what would otherwise be lost. They connect the living to the dead. They give meaning to suffering and celebrate triumph. In a world of physical harshness, the stories provide the softness, the humanity, the reminder that we are more than just bodies struggling to survive. Death, when it comes, would be acknowledged with ritual. Not elaborate ceremonies, perhaps, but meaningful ones. The body would be prepared, wrapped in hides, placed in a location chosen with care. Personal items might be included, a favourite tool, a carved figure, food for a journey that none of the living can map, and the group would gather, would speak words of remembrance, would share stories of the deceased. This is for the dead, yes, but more importantly, it is for the living. It affirms that every individual matters, that contributions are remembered, that the person who has died will not be forgotten even as time passes. Some cultures might practice exposure, leaving the body in a designated place where scavengers can consume it. This is not disrespect. It is practicality and philosophy combined. The body returns to the cycle of life. The wolves and birds that fed on the same animals the person hunted now feed on the person. There is symmetry in this, a closing of the circle. Other groups might bury the dead, digging into frozen ground with effort that speaks to the importance of the ritual, or they might construct cairns, piles of stone that mark the location and honour the memory. Grief would be acknowledged but not prolonged beyond what the group can sustain. There is work to be done. Life continues. The dead would want the living to survive, to carry forward, to honour their memory by thriving rather than by languishing in sorrow. This is not callousness. It is necessity wearing the face of wisdom. You mourn, you remember, and you move forward. Because stopping is not an option when the world will freeze you if you stand still too long. Conflict within the group would be managed carefully. In a warm climate, a dispute might lead to someone leaving, finding another group or striking out alone. In the cold, exile is often a death sentence, so conflicts must be resolved, and the mechanisms for resolution would be well established. Elders would mediate. The group would hear both sides. Solutions would be found that restore harmony, without destroying the social fabric that everyone depends upon. Violence within the group would be rare, not because humans in the cold are inherently less aggressive, but because the consequences are too severe. A fight that escalates into serious injury or death weakens the entire group. 2 strong hunters feuding means less efficiency in the hunt, less food for everyone, greater risk when coordination is essential. The pressure to maintain peace would be immense, and individuals would internalize this from childhood. Control your anger, resolve disputes with words, save your aggression for the hunt, for the predators, for the true threats outside the circle of firelight. But between groups, conflict would be different. Competition for hunting grounds, for resources, for survival itself might occasionally lead to confrontations. These would be cautious affairs, more posturing than bloodshed when possible, because both sides know that losing members in a fight leaves you vulnerable to the environment. Yet sometimes, conflict would be unavoidable. Territorial disputes, stolen resources, old grievances, and in those moments, the same cooperation that makes hunting successful would make warfare devastatingly effective. Groups would recognize each other through markers, styles of tool making, patterns on clothing, ways of speaking. These markers create identity, the sense of us and them. And while there might be trade between groups, sharing of knowledge, even intermarriage to strengthen alliances and prevent inbreeding, there would also be wariness. Trust within the group is absolute. Trust between groups is always conditional. Trade, when it occurs, would involve items that cannot be made or found locally. Flint from a distant quarry, valued for its superior knapping qualities. Ochre for paint, used in rituals and art. Shells from the sea, rare and precious this far inland, made into beads or ornaments. Furs from animals that do not range in your territory. These trade goods would travel long distances, passed from group to group, each exchange building relationships, creating networks that span the frozen landscape. The concept of wealth would exist but would be understood differently than in our world. Wealth is not accumulation of objects, it is relationships, obligations owed to you by others, debts of gratitude and reciprocity. The person who has given generously, who has shared when others were in need, who has taught valuable skills, that person is wealthy because they can call on others in their time of need. The person who hoards, who gives nothing, who breaks the bonds of reciprocity, that person is poor no matter how many possessions they have, because when hardship comes, no one will help them. This social wealth would be carefully tracked, remembered by everyone. You helped me during the hard winter 3 years ago. I am in your debt. When you need help, I will provide. These obligations would not be written, but they would be as binding as any contract. Breaking them would be social death, the loss of reputation and standing that makes life within the group untenable. Better to starve yourself than to fail to repay a debt, because the consequences of being cast out are worse than hunger. Leadership, as mentioned earlier, would be earned rather than inherited, but the qualities that earn leadership would be specific to the environment. Physical strength matters, but so does wisdom. The ability to read weather signs, knowledge of where resources can be found, success in past hunts, but also fairness, the willingness to listen, the ability to make decisions that benefit the group, even when those decisions are personally costly. A leader who favours family over merit, who takes more than their share, who makes poor decisions that endanger the group, such a leader would not lead for long. Others would stop following. Influence would shift to someone more capable. In rare cases, leadership might be challenged directly, not with violence, but with the ultimate form of democracy, people choosing who to follow. If a new shelter needs to be built and 2 people propose different locations, the group might split, some following one leader and some the other. Whichever leader's judgment proves superior will gain followers, the other will lose influence. This is natural selection operating on the cultural level, favouring those whose decisions lead to success and filtering out those whose decisions lead to failure. Women's roles in this society would be complex. Physically, they would be at a disadvantage in tasks requiring raw strength, but pregnancy and child rearing would not exclude them from other forms of contribution. Older women, past childbearing years, would be among the most valuable members of the community. They would have survived longer than most, which means they possess knowledge that has been tested by time. They would know plants, medicines, the making of tools and clothing, the songs and stories that preserve culture. They would teach the young mediate disputes and provide the institutional memory that keeps the group functional. Younger women would participate in hunts when they could, especially in roles that require precision rather than strength, setting traps, processing kills, tracking, and in gathering, which in this cold world would be less about plants and more about finding resources like bird eggs, frozen fish, small game caught in snares. The division of labour would be practical rather than rigid. Everyone does what they can do well, what contributes most to survival. In a world where every person must pull their weight, gender roles would be less about ideology and more about efficiency. But this would not mean equality in the modern sense. Physical differences are real. Pregnancy is demanding. Nursing takes time and energy. These biological facts would shape social structure. Yet within those constraints there would be flexibility, respect for individual capability, recognition that the best trap setter might be a woman, the best hide worker might be a man, and what matters most is that the work gets done well. The education of children would include both practical skills and cultural knowledge. Boys and girls would learn together until a certain age, absorbing the common knowledge that everyone needs: how to start a fire, how to stay warm, how to read the sky for weather, basic orientation using stars. Then training would diverge based on aptitude and interest as much as gender. The child who shows talent with a needle will learn sewing. The child who is patient and observant will learn tracking. The child who is strong and bold will learn the weapons of the hunt. But all children would learn the stories, the history of the group passed down in oral tradition, the songs that mark seasons and celebrations, the values that hold the community together. This cultural education would be considered as important as practical skills, because without the culture, the group would fragment into individuals, and individuals cannot survive the cold alone. Play would be recognized as essential training. Children wrestling are learning combat and strength. Children tracking small animals are learning observation and patience. Children building miniature shelters from sticks and snow are learning architecture and problem solving. Adults would watch this play, would occasionally intervene with suggestions or demonstrations, but mostly would let the children learn through doing, through failing, through trying again. Adolescence would be a time of testing, not formal examinations, but gradual increases in responsibility, watching to see how the young person handles pressure, danger, failure. A teenager might be given more important roles in the hunt, allowed to craft their own tools, expected to contribute ideas during group discussions. Mistakes would be corrected but not punished, harshly, because mistakes are how learning happens. But repeated failure, patterns of incompetence or laziness or poor judgment, these would be noted, the community would remember. And when adulthood comes, those memories would shape how the person is perceived and what roles they are trusted with. The transition from child to adult would not be a single moment but a process. First, solo kill is one marker, but there would be others. Mastery of a critical skill, demonstration of courage in a crisis, contribution of an innovation or insight that benefits the group. Multiple achievements would accumulate until one day, without formal announcement, the young person realizes they are being treated as an adult, consulted in decisions, expected to contribute as an equal, given responsibilities that matter, and with adulthood comes the weight of knowledge that was partially shielded during childhood. The understanding of how precarious existence is, how many ways there are to die, how much, depends on luck as much as skill. The adult knows that every winter might be the one where the herds do not come, where the stored food runs out, where hard decisions must be made about who eats and who goes without. This knowledge is sobering. It creates a seriousness, a depth, that childhood's relative innocence does not carry. Yet adults would also know joy, would create moments of lightness amid the weight, celebrations after successful hunts, festivals marking the return of the sun after the longest night, games and contests that build camaraderie, music and dance around the fire. These moments would be precious, savoured, because they represent humanity asserting itself against the cold, against the darkness, against the relentless pressure to be nothing but survival machines. The old would be treated with the respect that knowledge and experience command, but also with the realism that the environment demands. An elder who can no longer contribute, who becomes a burden rather than an asset, would face a choice. Some might choose to leave, to walk into the cold one final time, sparing the group the cost of caring for them. This would be seen not as suicide, but as a final act of contribution, a gift to the young who need the resources more. Others might remain, supported by the group in recognition of their lifetime of service, fed and cared for until natural death comes. These are not easy truths. They are harsh and would trouble modern sensibilities. But in the context of a world where survival margins are razor thin, they make a terrible kind of sense. The group cannot carry more weight than it can bear. Every mouth to feed is a calculation, and while sentiment matters, while love and gratitude are real, they must be balanced against the practical realities of limited food, limited warmth, limited capacity to sustain life. The spiritual beliefs that would emerge from such an existence would be shaped by the constant awareness of mortality and the power of natural forces. Deities or spirits, if they exist in this worldview, would be harsh and demanding, reflecting the environment. The winter spirit that brings storms, the hunt spirit that grants success or withholds it, the death spirit that claims the old and the weak. Prayers and offerings would not be requests for miracles, but acknowledgements of forces beyond human control, attempts to maintain right relationship with the powers that govern existence. Shamans or spiritual leaders might emerge, individuals who claim to communicate with these forces, to intercede on behalf of the group. They would perform rituals before hunts, seeking favour. They would conduct ceremonies to mark seasonal transitions. They would interpret signs and omens, providing guidance based on their claimed connection to the spirit world. Whether this connection is real or imagined would matter less than whether their guidance proves useful. A shaman whose predictions are accurate, whose rituals seem to correlate with success, would be valued and followed. One whose guidance leads to failure would lose influence. Dreams would be taken seriously, seen as messages or visions rather than random neural firing. A hunter who dreams of a particular valley might interpret this as a sign to hunt there. An elder who dreams of a departed ancestor might share the dream as a warning or blessing. The boundary between waking and sleeping, between the material and spiritual, would be more porous than in our rationalist modern worldview. This is not ignorance. It is a different way of organising reality, one that acknowledges the limits of human understanding and leaves room for mystery. Art, as mentioned earlier, would serve both practical and spiritual purposes, but it would also be beautiful, created with care and attention that goes beyond mere utility. A carved bone tool might be decorated with patterns that please the eye. A hide garment might be dyed and adorned with beads. These touches of beauty would not be frivolous. They would be assertions of humanity, declarations that we are more than just survival machines, that we can create, that we can appreciate, that we can find meaning and joy even in the harshest circumstances. The aesthetic that would develop would be distinct, shaped by available materials and cultural values. Clean lines, symmetry, representations that are stylized rather than realistic, capturing essence rather than exact detail. Colours would be limited to what nature provides. Red from ochre, black from charcoal, white from chalk or bone, yellow from certain clays. These pigments would be mixed with fat or water, applied with fingers or crude brushes made from hair or plant fibres. Some individuals would show particular talent for art, and they would be encouraged to develop this skill. Their creations would be valued, traded, preserved. The best pieces might be ceremonial objects used in rituals passed down through generations, becoming heirlooms that carry the weight of history. A carved figure that belonged to a renowned ancestor would be treasured not just for its craftsmanship, but for its connection to the past, to the people who came before, to the continuity that defines the group's identity. Music would develop its own sophistication, rhythms that mimic the heartbeat, the breath, the footfalls of running. Melodies that rise and fall like wind, like the howling of wolves, like the calls of birds. Harmonies would be discovered through experimentation, voices blending in ways that create something greater than the individual parts. And certain songs would become traditional, learned by every generation, performed at specific occasions, carrying meanings that go beyond the words themselves. The practical knowledge of this civilization would be vast and detailed. Every plant that can be eaten, every rock that can be worked, every sign that predicts weather. The best times to hunt different animals, the migration, routes of herds, the places where water can be found even in winter, the techniques for working bone, stone, hide, wood, the properties of different materials and how they interact. This knowledge would be distributed across the community, different individuals specializing in different areas, but all sharing their expertise for the common good. Innovation would happen slowly but steadily. Someone notices that a spear point hafted at a certain angle penetrates better. The technique spreads. Someone discovers that treating hide with a particular mixture makes it more supple. The method is adopted. Someone figures out how to weave plant fibers into cordage stronger than the individual strands. The skill is taught. Each small improvement builds on previous ones, creating a ratchet effect where knowledge accumulates over generations. But innovation would also be constrained by tradition. The old ways work. They have been tested by time. Changing them is risky. What if the new method fails at a critical moment? What if abandoning the traditional ritual brings bad luck? This tension between innovation and tradition would be constant, with some individuals pushing for change and others urging caution. The balance would shift based on circumstances. In times of crisis, when the old ways are failing, innovation would be embraced more readily. In times of relative stability, tradition would reassert itself. Technology would reach a certain plateau, limited by available materials and energy sources. Metal would be rare or non-existent, unless native copper or meteoric iron is found and worked cold. Most tools would be stone, bone, wood, hide. These materials impose limits on what can be created, but within those limits, sophistication would be remarkable. Composite tools with multiple parts precisely fitted, hafted implements that maximize leverage, traps with trigger mechanisms, clothing with sewn seams and fitted shapes that maximize warmth. The understanding of physics and engineering would be intuitive rather than formal. No equations or diagrams, but deep practical knowledge of leverage, balance, tension, compression. The person who builds shelters knows how weight distributes through a structure, even if they cannot explain it in mathematical terms. The person who crafts spear throwers understands projectile motion through experience, through trial and error, through the accumulated wisdom of generations of hunters who refine the design. Medicine would be limited but not non-existent. Herbal remedies for common ailments, poultices for wounds, techniques for setting broken bones, knowledge of which plants reduce fever or ease pain. But much illness would be beyond treatment, attributed to spiritual causes rather than understood in biological terms. Infection would kill, parasites would weaken. Injuries that in modern times could be healed would be crippling or fatal. Life expectancy would be shorter, not because the people are less robust, but because the environment and lack of medical knowledge exact a heavy toll. Yet those who survive would be hardy. Natural selection operating every generation, favouring the strong, the lucky, the genetically blessed. Infant mortality would be high, winnowing the population. But those who make it through the dangerous years of childhood would often live into their 40s or 50s, sometimes beyond. Age would be marked not by calendars but by physical decline. Grey hair, weakening strength, dimming eyesight. These signs would be noted, would signal the transition from full contributor to elder, whose value lies in knowledge rather than physical capacity. The concept of retirement would not exist. You contribute what you can for as long as you can. When you can no longer hunt, you teach. When you can no longer craft tools, you tell stories. When you can no longer walk far, you tend the fire. Work continues until death, or until you choose to leave. The modern idea of years of leisure, after a lifetime of labour, would seem bizarre, wasteful even, to a people where every pair of hands is needed. And so we come full circle, back to the question that started this journey. What if humans had evolved in a colder world? We have walked through the frozen landscape, seen the bodies shaped by cold, the minds expanded by necessity, the cultures forged by hardship. We have watched the fires burn and the hunts unfold, and the children learn the ways of their ancestors. We have imagined a humanity both familiar and strange, recognizably human yet fundamentally different. The physical legacy would be unmistakable. Stocky frames built to conserve heat, powerful muscles burning fuel to generate warmth. noses shaped to condition frigid air, bodies optimized for a world where temperature is always an enemy, where every adaptation serves the single goal of maintaining the internal fire that is life. These are not monsters or aliens, they are us, shaped by different forces, showing what human potential looks like when cold is the defining pressure. The cognitive legacy would be equally profound. Brains enlarged by the demands of planning, memory, problem-solving in an environment that punishes mistakes with death. Minds capable of tracking vast amounts of information about animal behavior, weather patterns, resource locations. Intelligence not as abstract reasoning for its own sake, but as a tool for survival, honed to razor sharpness by thousands of generations facing the same unforgiving test. Pass or fail, survive or die, think or freeze. The cultural legacy would be the synthesis of body and mind, the expression of human creativity and cooperation under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Fire mastery that borders on art, shelter construction that demonstrates engineering principles discovered through trial and error, clothing that transforms raw materials into life-saving technology, social structures built on trust because without trust the group fails and everyone dies, stories that preserve knowledge and values across generations, rituals that mark the moments of transition and bind the community together. All of this would shape the modern world if we were truly the descendants of these ice-forged people. Our cities might be different, designed with different priorities. Communal spaces would dominate over private ones, reflecting the emphasis on group cohesion. Buildings would be constructed for maximum heat retention, small windows and thick walls, clustered close together to share warmth. Even in a world where artificial heating makes such design choices unnecessary, the psychological preference might linger. We would feel uncomfortable in sprawling open spaces. We would crave closeness, density, the reassurance of others nearby. Our economies might operate on different principles. The value placed on sharing, on reciprocity, on the idea that wealth is measured in relationships rather than possessions. These could translate into economic systems that prioritize collective welfare over individual accumulation. Not communism in the political sense, but a natural inclination toward mutual support, towards safety nets, toward the understanding that everyone's survival is linked. Hoarding would be seen not just as economically inefficient, but as morally wrong, a violation of the fundamental principle that we all depend on each other. Technology might advance differently. The emphasis on reliability over innovation, on testing thoroughly before adopting widely, on preserving traditional knowledge while cautiously integrating new ideas. These tendencies could slow certain kinds of progress while accelerating others. We might be less quick to abandon working methods for untested alternatives, more conservative in our technological choices, but also more thoughtful, more deliberate, less prone to pursuing novelty simply because it is novel. Our relationship with nature would carry forward the complex mix of respect and necessity that defines a hunter's mindset. Animals are not pets, not decorations, not objects. They are fellow beings, worthy of recognition, even as we kill and eat them. This might manifest in modern attitudes toward conservation, toward sustainable practices, toward the idea that using resources does not mean wasting them. Every part utilized, nothing discarded carelessly. The mammoth hunter's ethic applied to a world of abundance rather than scarcity. Climate change in a world shaped by cold might be understood differently. We would have cultural memory, encoded in stories and traditions, of times when the world was even colder, when survival was even more precarious. The current warming might be seen not as catastrophe but as opportunity, at least initially. More habitable land, longer growing seasons, less constant struggle against the cold. But this would be tempered by caution, by the understanding that change is dangerous even when it seems beneficial, by the knowledge that systems in equilibrium are fragile and shifting them can have unpredictable consequences. Our psychology would carry the marks of cold-adapted ancestors in ways both obvious and subtle. The baseline level of anxiety, the constant low-level vigilance that scans for threats and plans for contingencies. This would not be pathology, It would be normal, the default state of human consciousness. Relaxation would be learned, practiced, deliberately cultivated, rather than being the natural resting state. And this vigilance would serve us well in many contexts, making us excellent planners, thorough risk assessors, people who prepare for the worst even while hoping for the best. Social bonds would matter enormously. Loneliness would not just feel bad, it would feel dangerous, triggering ancient alarms that equate isolation with death. Community would be sought not just for companionship, but as a psychological necessity. The modern epidemic of loneliness might be even more acute, or perhaps less common, depending on how society structured itself. If the cultural emphasis on community remained strong, if social institutions built connection into daily life, if the value placed on relationships carried forward, we might be better at maintaining the bonds that cold-adapted humans needed to survive. Trust would be both easier and harder. Easier within the in-group, where shared identity and mutual dependence create strong bonds. Harder across group boundaries, where the stranger is viewed with suspicion until proven trustworthy. This in-group preference would shape politics, social movements, patterns of cooperation and conflict. It would be something to overcome consciously, to recognize as a legacy that no longer serves in an interconnected world. But the tendency would always be there, pulling toward tribal affiliation, toward the comfort of the familiar. Education would be valued highly, but the emphasis might be different. Less focus on individual achievement and competition, more focus on mastery and contribution. The goal would not be to stand out, but to fit in as a capable member of the collective. Innovation would still be encouraged, but as something that benefits everyone, not as a path to personal glory. The best teacher would be the one whose students learn well and go on to teach others, creating cascades of knowledge that strengthen the community. Gender relations might be more egalitarian in some ways, more traditional in others. The respect for female knowledge and contribution would be genuine, born from the reality that everyone's work matters. But biological differences would be acknowledged and accommodated rather than denied or ignored. The strongest hunter is usually male, the person who nurses the infant is always female, and these facts would be integrated into social structure without the baggage of superiority or inferiority. Different roles, all essential, all valued, violence would be controlled more strictly within the group since internal conflict weakens everyone. But between groups, when resources are contested or territory disputed, violence would erupt with coordinated efficiency. War would not be frequent, resources permitting peaceful coexistence most of the time, but when it comes, it would be approached with the same cooperative intensity that makes hunting successful. This legacy might make us simultaneously more peaceful in daily interactions and more dangerous when actual conflict arises. Art and music would hold particular importance as expressions of the human spirit asserting itself against the cold, against the darkness, against the weight of mere survival. They would be seen not as luxuries but as necessities, as the things that make life worth living beyond just not dying. Societies would support artists, musicians, storytellers, recognizing that these roles contribute to collective well-being in ways that cannot be measured in calories or shelter but matter nonetheless. The concept of the sacred, of the spiritual, would be deeply embedded, not necessarily in the form of organized religion, but as a worldview that acknowledges forces beyond human control, that sees meaning and intention in natural phenomena, that maintains connection to ancestors and tradition. Rituals would mark important transitions. Sacred spaces would exist where the ordinary rules are suspended, and the boundary between material and spiritual becomes thin. This is not irrationality. It is a different kind of rationality, one that addresses human needs for meaning and connection that pure materialism cannot satisfy. Time would be understood cyclically rather than linearly. The seasons return, the herds migrate and return. Life cycles through birth, growth, reproduction, death, and renewal. This cyclical view might make us more patient, more accepting of setbacks as temporary, more confident that hard times will pass because they always have before. It might also make us more complacent, less driven to create permanent change, more willing to accept the way things are because the wheel always turns anyway. The future, in such a worldview, would be seen as a continuation of the past, not identical because circumstances change and people adapt, but fundamentally similar. The same challenges in new forms, the same solutions refined and passed forward. Progress would be measured not in revolutionary transformations, but in incremental improvements, in the slow accumulation of knowledge and skill that makes each generation slightly better prepared than the last. But all of this is speculation, an elaborate thought experiment built on the foundation of what we know about evolution, environment, and human nature. The reality is that we did not evolve in perpetual cold. We evolved in warmth, in the grasslands and forests of Africa, where the sun shines hot and the challenges are different. And that evolutionary path shaped us in its own profound ways, giving us the bodies and minds and cultures we actually possess. Yet the exercise of imagining what might have been is not pointless. It illuminates what is. By seeing how different we could have been, we understand more clearly what we are. The human capacity for adaptation, for innovation, for cooperation, these are not specific to any one environment. They are fundamental to what it means to be human. Whether facing cold or heat, abundance or scarcity, we respond with creativity and resilience. We find ways to survive. We build cultures that give life meaning. We pass knowledge forward to our children. We are, in all circumstances, the species that asks why, and how, and what if. The cold-adapted humans we have imagined would recognize us as kin, despite the differences. They would see in us the same fundamental drives, the need for warmth and food and safety, the desire for companionship and understanding, the capacity for love and grief and joy, the ability to dream of something beyond the immediate struggle of survival. These are universal human qualities, shaped by environment but not created by it. They emerge from what we are at the deepest level, from the consciousness that distinguishes us from other animals, from the spark that makes us human regardless of circumstances. And we, looking at them across the gulf of this alternate history, would see ourselves reflected in their struggles and triumphs. The hunter waiting in the snow for the mammoth is not so different from us waiting for opportunity. The mother nursing her child by firelight is not so different from mothers throughout history, in all climates, doing whatever it takes to keep their children alive. The elder telling stories to preserve knowledge is not so different from teachers in classrooms, writers at keyboards, elders in every culture passing forward what they have learned. The cold would have shaped the details but not the essence. That essence, the core of what makes us human, transcends environment. It exists in warmth and in cold, in abundance and in scarcity, in ancient times and in modern days. It is the thing that allows us to imagine ourselves in different circumstances, to walk through thought experiments like this one and find meaning in them. It is consciousness itself, the ability to reflect on our own existence, to ask questions that have no answers, to create meaning where none is given. So what does it matter if we evolved in cold or warmth? It matters for understanding the particulars of our physical form, our cognitive quirks, our cultural tendencies. But it does not change the fundamental truth that we are the species that adapts, that learns, that creates, that survives. We are the inheritors of millions of years of evolution, shaped by countless environments and challenges, carrying within us the accumulated wisdom and adaptations of all who came before. The frozen world we walk through exists only in imagination, but the lessons it teaches are real. Cooperation matters, planning matters, knowledge matters, community matters. These truths are written in the bones of cold-adapted humans, and in our own bones as well, because they are not specific to any climate. They are the keys to survival for any human group in any environment. Learn them or perish. Live them or fail. Pass them forward or let the future die. And as you lie here now, in whatever warmth surrounds you, in whatever comfort you have found, consider the vast gulf between your existence and theirs. You do not hunt for your food. You do not build your shelter from mammoth bones. You do not maintain fire as the difference between life and death. You live in a world so transformed by technology and culture that the daily struggle of mere survival is, for most of us, a distant memory or an abstract concept. Yet you carry within you the legacy of that struggle. The anxiety that wakes you at night is your ancestors' vigilance, scanning for threats. The comfort you find in community is their need for cooperation. The satisfaction of learning and teaching is their emphasis on knowledge transfer. The stories you tell and listen to are their way of preserving culture. The warmth you seek is their constant quest for the fire. You're not separate from them. You are them, thousands of generations removed, living in circumstances they could never have imagined, facing challenges they would not recognize, using tools they could not have conceived, but human nonetheless, adaptable, resilient, creative, capable of surviving in environments that should kill you, of thriving where others would fail, of building something from nothing and passing it forward to those who come after. The cold world may be imaginary, but the human spirit that would have conquered it is real. It lives in you. Every time you face a challenge and overcome it, every time you help someone in need, every time you learn something and teach it to another, every time you plan for a future you will not see but hope to build for those who come after. You're doing what humans have always done, in cold and in warmth, in hardship and in ease. We adapt, we endure, we carry forward. The environment changes, the challenges shift, but the core remains, consciousness reaching forward through time, generation by generation, building on what came before, creating something new, passing it along. This is the human story, not the story of bodies shaped by cold or warmth, but the story of minds and spirits that transcend physical form, that create meaning in a universe that offers none, that refuse to accept mere survival when life and beauty and truth are possible. The footprints in the snow may fade, the fire may burn low, the voices around the hearth may fall silent, but the spirit that made the footprints, that lit the fire, that spoke the words, that spirit continues in you, in everyone who carries forward the legacy of being human, not perfect, not finished, not separate from nature or above it, but conscious, aware, capable of asking what if and wondering why and imagining how things could be different. This is the gift of consciousness. This is what makes us human, not the cold or the warmth, not the bodies or the tools, not the cultures or the stories, important as all of these are, but the spark itself, the awareness that looks out at the world and wonders, that sees the horizon and wants to know what lies beyond. That feels the cold and dreams of warmth. That knows death waits and chooses to live anyway. That understands the odds are impossible and tries nevertheless. The humans of the frozen earth would have had this spark. They would have looked at the ice and the darkness and the endless cold and said not surrender. But how? How do we survive this? How do we find warmth in a world of ice? How do we pass forward what we have learned so that our children do not have to rediscover it all? How do we make this brief existence mean something beyond just not dying? And they would have found answers, not perfect answers, not easy answers, but answers sufficient to keep going, to keep trying, to keep the fire burning through one more night and then another and then 1,000 more, sufficient to pass the knowledge forward to the next generation, sufficient to build cultures that gave life meaning and beauty even in the harshest circumstances, sufficient to become human in the fullest sense of that word. We honour them, these people who never existed, by recognising in their imagined struggle our own real one. The struggle is not against cold anymore for most of us. It is against loneliness, against meaninglessness, against the weight of modern life that can crush the spirit as surely as ancient cold crushed the body. But the tools are the same: community, knowledge, stories, the fire that brings us together, the understanding that we survive together or not at all. And so, as this long night draws toward its end, as the story winds down and the imagined cold recedes, take with you not facts about what might have been, but truths about what is. You are the inheritor of millions of years of adaptation. You carry within you the wisdom of countless ancestors who faced impossible odds and overcame them. You possess the same fundamental capacities they had, the same ability to learn, to cooperate, to create, to endure. The world you face is different from theirs, but it is still a world that demands from you everything they gave: courage, persistence, the willingness to help others because your survival is linked to theirs, the wisdom to learn from the past while adapting to the present, the vision to build for a future you may never see. These are not cold climate adaptations, they are human adaptations. They are who we are, who we have always been, who we will continue to be as long as consciousness persists. The cold earth is silent now. The mammoths have fallen. The fires have burned low. The voices have faded into the darkness from which they came. But the lesson remains, written not in ice but in the warm beating of your own heart. You endure, you adapt, you carry forward, and in doing so, you honour every human who has ever lived, in cold or warmth, in hardship or ease, in times remembered or long forgotten. The story ends where it began, with a question: what if? But the answer is not in the details of bodies or brains or cultures shaped by cold. The answer is in the recognition that what if is the human question, the question that separates us from all other life, the question that drives us forward into unknown futures, creating ourselves anew with each generation while carrying forward the essence of what we have always been. We are the species that asks what if, and in asking, we become something more than mere survivors. We become creators of meaning, shapers of destiny, carriers of the flame that is consciousness itself. Cold or warm, the fire burns. As long as it burns, we endure. As long as we endure, the question continues: what if? And the answer, always, is this: we will find a way. We always have. We always will. This is what it means to be human. This is what the cold would have taught us. This is what warmth teaches us still. Adapt, endure, carry forward. The world changes. We change with it. But the spark that makes us human, that spark remains, burning bright in the darkness, warming cold nights, lighting the way forward, and that light, that eternal human light shines on.